If we imagine the resurrected Christ's hands and feet, if we remember correctly, there were scars. Remember? If we remember the story of, I guess, doubting Thomas and that whole deal, if we remember that story, Christ invited him to stick his fingers in there, right? And to kind of examine the scars and um, holes in his hands and his feet himself. And I thought about this idea this past week, um, that what happened on Good Friday was traumatic. And if you're kind of thinking, well, duh, Wayne, of course it was traumatic. But I'm not even talking about Jesus. Okay, I'm not talking about Jesus. I'm talking about for those followers and disciples um, that saw with their own two eyes, experience the crucifixion in person. Now, I want us to kind of imagine that. We're a follower of Jesus. We devoted our entire lives to following him. I'm talking about our entire lives. And we, just, and we see him and watch him, our teacher, our rabbi, and friend, be tortured, humiliated, and executed, right in front of our eyes. Like we saw it. We saw the entire thing in person, right? We didn't just hear about it, or we didn't, secondary source, right? It was from our own two eyes that we saw it ourselves. And this was a guy, Jesus, who before all of these things happened, as we kind of think about this, was that he was the one that said things like to the disciples during their journeys and during the ministry of Christ, I must suffer, be rejected, and die. So he would lob these things in every now and then. Oh, and by the way, one of you guys will turn on me and stab me in the back royally. And oh yeah, the Romans, they will also mock and do a number on me as well. But by the way, I will rise again. I'll rise again. They will destroy this temple, and in 3 days, I will raise it up. Okay? Now I ask, would you believe this narrative if you kind of just lob these kind of things in, right? The whole I will rise again kind of idea. I want us to think about that. Like, would we? Especially after we saw with our own two eyes and what happened in real time, the god-awful things they did to Jesus, right? I'm not just talking on the cross. The process even before he was on the cross, the whole carrying the cross idea, the whips, the slashes, right? The mocking, right? The humiliation, all of that, right? Would we believe it, right? And I thought about that idea, and I was like, yeah, I don't know if I would, if I experienced that and saw that with my own two eyes. Because thinking about it this way, yeah, like I have a probably difficult time believing anything beyond what I've just seen and experienced. Okay, so with all that being said, I believe Jesus understood the doubt and disbelief of the disciples and the followers after he hung on that cross to die. And when he appeared, well, like he promised, he never breaks his promises. So when he appeared, if you remember, according to John's gospel, again, he showed everyone his scars, right? And that's fascinating, because one would think the resurrected Christ, in all of his glory, right? The power of God, the divine God, on full display, right? Just think the majesty, the wonder, the awe, would render those scars null and void, right? Wipe completely clean, make them disappear. But no. He showed them off, actually. He showed them off. The scars on the resurrected Christ were present for any and all to see. Okay? Now why? Right? After all of that, why? The resurrected Christ, I believe, that revealed his scars to prove his identity, to confirm his physical resurrection, and to demonstrate his victory over death. That's a way to say, see what they did? I'm still here, right? And these wounds kind of serve as a kind of an everlasting testament to his love, his sacrifice, and his continued humanity. Okay, because although we do see Jesus as kind of a supernatural kind of being, he was human, right? He did what humans did. The scars indicate that the same Jesus who was crucified is the same Jesus who is now glorified. Remembering back at the beginning of the year, our theme verse, if you remember that, a few months ago, about the idea of standing up, taking our mat, and going home. Right, that was Jesus's declaration to the man that was lying there invalid for like 38 years or so. Right, and the question was, well, why would Jesus tell us to pick up the thing that's been carrying us for so long? Well, I believe it's because so that we can carry it differently. Okay, as a reminder that Christ reframes our difficult times into something victorious now. That we can carry it different because Christ, well, carries it with us. So now, with Jesus, the scars and markings on his bodies that represented death, well, yeah, death did not win that battle. And the scars are a reminder that death and destruction, to go even further, evil, chaos, bitterness, depression, fill in the blank, right, will never ever come out victorious and will not last. It can't, okay? It cannot, because with the resurrected Christ, it's already been completed, right? It's already been won, okay? Thanks be to God for this. Now, our scripture for today finds us on that Emmaus walk and seeing how it concludes. How Jesus, again, I think I talked about last time, met two disciples whom basically gave up, literally gave up. How he joined them on that 7-mile journey. And again, last time with these disciples, not knowing that they are in the midst of the resurrected Christ. That sometimes the answers to life's questions, well, sometimes are literally right under our noses or walking right beside us. So now we're going to begin part 2 of what we started last week. So our scripture comes from Luke 24, verses 25 through 35. So Luke 24, 25 through 35. And it says this in verse 25. Then he, being Jesus, said to him, again, this was immediately after, they're having a conversation about what's kind of going on or what happened the past few days. So Jesus said to them, "Oh, how foolish you are, and how slow of heart to believe all that the prophets have declared. Was it not necessary that the Messiah should suffer these things and then enter into his glory?" Then beginning with Moses and all the prophets, he interpreted to them the things about himself in all the scriptures. As they came near the village to which they were going, he walked ahead as if he were going on. But they, being the 2 disciples, urged him strongly, saying, "Stay with us. Stay with us, because it is almost evening and the day is nearly over." So he went in to stay with them. When he was at the table with them, he took bread, blessed, and broke it, and gave it to them. Verse 31, then their eyes were opened, and they recognized him, and he vanished from their sight. They said to each other, "Were not our hearts burning within us while he was talking to us on the road, while he was opening the scriptures to us?" That same hour they got up and returned to Jerusalem, and they found the 11 and their companions gathered together. They were saying, "The Lord has risen indeed, and he has appeared to Simon." Then they told what had happened on the road and how he had been made known to them in the breaking of the bread. Phenomenal, right? Phenomenal. Now, going back earlier into the scripture, the disciples characterized the resurrection report of the woman, if you remember that going all the way back to John's Gospel, how that was Mary, as most likely unbelievable, right? Maybe perhaps reflecting their view that the woman was kind of suffering from kind of some kind of disturbance, like she just maybe saw something, right? Kind of an idea. So given probably the inability of the disciples on this Emmaus walk to not recognize Jesus first, it would stand to reason that they would regard the woman's testimony as nonsense, right? Because they heard it before the walk, right? But it didn't register with them, right? So therefore, Jesus coming next to them on their beginning of the walk, maybe that was the reason why they couldn't recognize Jesus at first, right? So again, stated more sharply and to be abundantly clear, it is not the woman who are delirious, right? It's not. In verse 25, as this scripture begins, Jesus is a little straightforward now. He's a little straightforward. How foolish you are. How foolish you are. Now, the term foolish in the original language could be taken almost like a term of endearment in some ways. Think something along the lines of, oh, you sweet dummies. Come here, give me a hug, you, you sweet idiots. Something along those lines. How could you miss this? Come on. Come on, let's figure this out together. In the words of the early 4th century church father, St. Augustine, conveys kind of a beautiful paradox where he says, the teacher was walking with them along the way, and he himself was the way. Okay, think about that a few times, right? Augustine goes on to say this too, and because they observed hospitality, him who they knew not yet in the expounding of scriptures, they suddenly know in the breaking of bread. So again, I ask, what does it mean to meet resurrection on the road? Okay, again, going back to last time, as a stranger. As a stranger. When we are between places and perhaps besides ourselves. I mean, we could go as far as to think what are the kind of the ethical directives of this text, especially the encounter with Jesus as a, again, stranger in a strange land, right? Remember, stranger back in this context and back or in the original language meant a migrant, right? Someone not from this land, right? It's the kind of idea. So what would it mean to encounter Jesus as a stranger in a strange land? Do we take this resurrection, almost this weird homeless one, into our homes, right? Food for thought, again. So food for thought, if you can think about that. So if we think about that moment on the road, again, this is a risen Christ, folks. This is the risen Christ. He could have just said, it's me. Ta-da, kind of idea, right? He could have revealed himself instantly, right? But instead, well, he took this opportunity to teach. He walks them through the story. Now why? Well, I believe that because God is often at work in our lives long enough before maybe we even realize it. Understanding doesn't always come instantly. Sometimes it does, but I believe that a lot of the times it doesn't, okay? It just kind of unfolds naturally. If we think about how many times we have kind of looked back on our lives and realized, well, God was present in a moment that you did not recognize him at the time, right? I could probably think of a handful of them, right? Of those instances where I look back, I'm like, wow, God was really present in that time. I had zero idea, right? And if you think about that I believe that garners faith, right, within us. Maybe it was a conversation, right? Or maybe it was a delay, right? Or we had to wait. Even disappointment, right? I would argue maybe even through disappointment, right? The truth of the matter is that Jesus was already at work on the road before their eyes were opened. And maybe that's true for us right now, that he's at work in our lives and we just don't know it. I pray that we would have eyes and ears to see what the risen Christ is up to in our lives. That when they reach their destination, Jesus acts like he's going further. Interesting, right? And this is such a small, ordinary moment, but I believe that it actually matters because, well, the two disciples, what do? They invite him in. Stay with us. Stay with us. They say to this man, whom again was a stranger, or they thought was a stranger, a migrant, an immigrant, someone not from here. Okay? It's getting late. The day is ending. It's just simple hospitality from these two disciples who do not know they're dealing with the resurrected Christ. Simple hospitality, nothing dramatic. And yet, this ordinary invitation becomes the turning point of the entire story. Okay? Just that invitation. Okay? Because it's at the table. Remember that table back during the holidays we kind of spoke about at length? Remember the table? A lot of cool things happen at the table during eating, right? It was at the table, not during the teaching, which is interesting, right? Not during the teaching, but at the table that everything changes. He took bread, according to the scripture, gave thanks, broke it, and began to give it to them. And suddenly, after that, their eyes are opened. At a table, at a simple table, breaking bread. Okay? And they recognize them. Isn't that striking? They recognize him there. It wasn't a miracle on the road, all right? It wasn't through this, fantastic teaching, right? But in a familiar, very familiar, ordinary act, breaking bread, eating, right? Something we're all good at, all right? We're all good at that. The same action Jesus has done countless times before in his ministry, right? All through the gospel narratives. The same rhythm of presence. God shows up in the ordinary, in a meal, in a moment that could easily be overlooked. And sometimes we tend to look for God in the dramatic or the extraordinary or the unmistakable. And I believe that he shows up there, obviously. But I believe that this passage reminds us that Jesus is often most clearly seen in the simple, in the familiar, in the everyday. Okay, something that you and I could relate with on a lot of levels, right? Now, to note, the Emmaus table differs slightly from the institution of the Lord's Supper or communion as we know it, right? As found in, earlier in the Gospels. Now, notably, there is no kind of cup mentioned, right? And Jesus does not speak the words of institution at this table, right? This Emmaus table. Instead, the Gospel writer simply tells us that he blesses the bread and breaks it. Of note is the intimacy of the moment. Okay, kind of picture ourselves in that moment, right? Jesus is not standing apart from these disciples as though untouchable. It's like the resurrected Christ, don't touch me, like, oh, like kind of thing. No, that wasn't the idea here. In ancient Mediterranean fashion or in the ancient Near Eastern culture, they are reclining at a table. What reclining means is that they're literally laying down while eating, right? And just hanging out, spending time with one another. A physical closeness, right? That would likely be probably uncomfortable for us 21st century diners, right? Because we like our bubbles, right? It wasn't so much of that. There wasn't a lot of that, during this time. And the moment they recognize him, in a very godlike fashion, poof, he disappears. Disappears. Which, to think about it, seems almost unfair, doesn't it? Like, just as they see him clearly, he's gone. Boom, just like that. But something changed. Something has changed, though. As well, hopefully it should have, right? They say to each other, were not our hearts burning within us while he talked with us on the road? They realize something now that they couldn't fully see before. Jesus was present the entire time he was there. And that realization changes everything. Their confusion, boom, turns into clarity. Okay? They get up and immediately, according to the scriptures, go back to Jerusalem, right? 7 miles in the dark. It's a little dangerous, right? But they did it because once you've truly encountered the risen Lord, it's impossible. I believe it's impossible just to stay where you are. Even if the circumstances haven't changed, guess what? We have, right? We have. So therefore, get up and go, right? So remember, this whole journey started with a lot of sadness, a lot of confusion, a lot of hopelessness, etc., etc. But it ends with something a little bit different. And it's not just recognition, right? They just didn't, recognize, right? Like, oh, that's you kind of thing. But peace, right? Remember that last time. Peace. And it's a peace not because they now understand everything perfectly, not because all their questions are answered. Remember, once they saw the risen Christ for who he was, boom, he disappeared, right? So they probably had a lot of questions that weren't answered, right? But because they have encountered Jesus, they now have peace. Peace doesn't come, again, from having all the answers. It comes from knowing who is with you. And sometimes that peace comes very, very, very quietly, right? In the midst of our own circumstances, in the midst of our own heart, it comes quietly. Through scripture opened, through bread that's broken, through a simple invitation that stated, stay with us. The disciples didn't recognize Jesus when he first showed up. And isn't that the reality of disappointment, right? In a lot of ways, isn't that the reality of shame? Or even having a broken heart? Death and resurrection do indeed fit into a long established pattern of the way God works in a world as unrelentingly real as the one we currently live in. Right? Because we see both all the time, don't we? We see a lot of death, but then we also see a lot of lives renewed, right? Just like we saw with our friend Kevin, right? During Easter. But this text requires a very, very honest recognition of the reality of deep, deep disappointment. I believe something that we all can attach to, right? Something we've all experienced, right? Because the joy at the end of the scene is real. It's very real, right? As in the racing report of the resurrection in the scene immediately prior to this one. But before came that statement, right? Came that very, very honest, disappointed statement. We had hoped, right? We had hoped and dreamed of all these things to happen. But because we saw with our two own eyes, our rabbi, teacher, and friend, crucified and mocked, it all shattered, right? So therefore, we have no hope now. And that's heavy, right? It's a heavy, heavy burden because in a way, it requires us to admit that maybe we were wrong, right? And no one likes admitting that, right? That we were wrong. Maybe we failed, right? Maybe we went on the wrong road and chose the wrong way at that fork in the road and want to redo. Resurrection, yes, there's a lot of flash and dash, right? Lives changed for all the right reasons. But sometimes resurrection does not overcome all disappointment. And that's a reality I imagine we've all kind of been through. Because if we remember, all those scars, right, we've gained in our life, right? And sometimes those scars are difficult to think about, right? Even today. Sometimes, I'm not talking about all the time, but sometimes it's hard to believe that Christ has reframed them all. And trust me, I know, right? I know. This is something I battle with all the time. I've heard it said, preaching resurrection requires honesty, right? Honesty. And that resurrection also happens to lead to a deep disappointment. So yes, the disciples didn't recognize Jesus at first at the beginning of their 7-mile walk. But I want to be clear about this, but that didn't mean he wasn't there, because he was. And the same is true for us. Okay? The same truth is there for us as well. So, may we pay attention to the road. Pay attention to the table. Pay attention to the quiet, ordinary moments, because that's often where Jesus is. Okay? And that's often where everything changes. Just like how we concluded last time, I like to conclude with this, that the Gospel of Luke's story, reminds us that our relationship with the resurrected Christ is a relationship of long walks, risky conversations, very risky conversations, reframed traumas, and quiet dinners. An intimate relationship between Christ and the church, of words shared and bread broken. May we, as people of God, people of faith, encounter these things, right? And tackle it head on. Pray that we be honest with our disappointment, because, well, the simple truth is that if we feel that Christ isn't with us, well, I'd like to say that he is, right? Walking right beside us, whether we know it or not. And I pray that one day we could look back and see the workings of his hands on our lives. So may we experience the resurrected Christ in all of his glories, scars included.